Do you ever find it difficult as a man to express your emotions or to even talk about your feelings? In this video, we're going to talk about why that is difficult for men in our society today, and kind of dive into maybe what we can do about it. Research does show that men who are able to express themselves emotionally end up with less depression, anxiety, living happier lives, and also even potentially with less physical problems as well. And so I'm actually going to open up today's session by sharing a quote by Robert Bly. Robert Bly was a huge part of the men's movement in the early 80s and 90s and part of the mythopoetic movement. And he was a poet who really devoted a huge part of his career towards helping and working with men. And so this quote comes from him. "The man who cannot express his emotions is doomed to live in the shadows of his soul. The modern man is estranged from his feelings and from the wilderness of his natural state. He's often trapped in the idea that being tough means suppressing his emotions." And so this quote really kind of does touch on the core of what we're talking about here. That in our society today, we have mistaken this idea of being tough with the inability to feel our emotions. It actually takes a lot more courage to be able to open oneself up. Vulnerability actually requires courage, and that's the paradox here that we're speaking of, that true power and true strength comes from the ability to feel emotions. And so in order to understand how we've even gotten to where we've gotten to today, it's really important to understand historical context as well as cultural context as well, to see sort of perhaps why we've gotten to where we've gotten to today. I would go as far as to argue that our culture today and the generations that we have today are privileged in the sense that we now have an opportunity to feel our emotions, whereas perhaps our ancestors didn't as much. I think that if we're to go back 100, even 200 years ago, much more of the human life was spent in more of a realm of survival than we have in today's world, especially in Western culture, especially in the United States or other Western countries. Is that today we have an opportunity now where we actually have enough comfortability in our day-to-day life, perhaps where we can start exploring these things. Whereas our ancestors, even as recently as 60, 70 years ago, who were fighting in World War II, who were going through the Great Depression, who have been countlessly fighting wars, didn't really have the opportunities to express or feel their emotions. But if we go back even further, we go back thousands of years, we'll understand that expressing of emotions is something that men did very often. In, Greek plays, there was huge expressions of emotion. That's why they had tragedy and comedies, to help people to feel their emotions. They actually believed that the plays at a collective level would help the emotions to channel through and to process and to heal, so that they didn't get welled up in the community. And then if you go back to, indigenous tribal times here in the United States, it was more recently with the First Nations and Native American peoples. And then for some of us, including myself, who, perhaps come from like an Irish lineage or a Caucasian lineage, or even some other places around the world, that indigenous culture may have gone back, 2,000, 3,000 years ago, where there were men who were still going through rites of passage and mentorship and essentially bringing men through various stages of early adolescence. There's a lot of work done in the mythopoetic space by Joseph Campbell, Robert Bly, Michael Mead, and some other people who have essentially said that without having some sort of psychological break or death from boyhood into manhood, that, there isn't like a safe transition period that we have in today's culture. And there's something that occurs within the human psyche at an unconscious level that starts to seek that transition. I know for myself, when I turned about 16 or 17 years old, there are certain rites of passage in our culture, like getting a driver's license, or, at 21, the drinking age, being an adult when you turn 18. But the thing is when I turned 18 years old, I didn't actually quite feel like an adult yet. It took me a little bit longer to kind of have that onset to actually understand that I'm an adult. And it's interesting because, one day I woke up 17, the next day I woke up 18. And if I were to have been born in a different culture, maybe thousands of years ago, or even today in some indigenous cultures that are still around, some older man would have probably taken me through an initiatory experience of having some kind of psychological death. In ancient times, sometimes they would strip the boys from the tribe. A group of men would come and take the boys and who are ready to turn, to have that psychological break to turn into men, and they'd take them out and have them go through a series of trials and tribulations, essentially creating some form of an ego death to then symbolize that there is a formation of a man. And typically some, significant features of that initiatory experience, as Robert Bly talks about in his book Iron John, is that there's some kind of a wounding process that actually occurs. So essentially what we're talking about here is that if we don't have healthy role models in our day-to-day life showing us what it is to be a man, then essentially we sort of seek that from our own generation. And so it's almost like now each generation is sort of running themselves. This is what Robert Bly talks about when he talks about a vertical society as opposed to a horizontal society. He says that today we're living in a horizontal society because many generations don't really interact intergenerationally anymore. We don't really seek wisdom from the elders or hang out with grandfathers or uncles and in community in that same way. And we also don't have role models in our lives that show us what a healthy form of, masculinity, maybe what a healthy romantic relationship might look like. And so essentially what we're talking about here is that as young boys and young men, part of the crisis that we have here is that there is a lack of role models and community surrounding boys and men being together to understand and to work through at an emotional level. In my experience of working with men are extremely emotional and extremely intuitive creatures. And when we get to the point of actually breaking through in some of our sessions when I'm working with men is just like this overwhelming emotion. And there's nothing like just being around a man who's deeply grieving and going through that process. It's extremely beautiful. And there's so much power that comes with that. In our culture, we've been lied to in thinking that, crying is somehow a form of weakness. And there's actually some statistics here that we have. So research indicates that 38% of men do not talk about their feelings and 27% have never cried or shown emotion in front of others. And so that's really significant to understand because what that means is that we're not allowing emotions to process through our body. Typically, when we were young children, we were conditioned as boys to not cry, and in some cases, to not laugh, to, not have to show joy. And especially with the crying, I know for myself that crying was somehow a form of weakness. And I was constantly shamed by my peers and those around me anytime I cried. And so it took me a while in my adult life to start learning how to open up in front of other people. And it took some deep healing work as well. What ends up happening when we don't give ourselves permission to cry, something will happen and that emotion doesn't go away. It gets stored inside of the body and then it can create health conditions as well. And so I think that's what's so important about Robert Bly's quote here. This first line I think is so significant. The man who cannot express his emotions is doomed to live in the shadows of his soul. And what that means to me is essentially if we're unable to feel and express our emotions, we're unable to truly enjoy life. That life is actually felt in our emotions. Joseph Campbell says that bliss is any emotion felt fully. And I know for myself that when I'm cathartically letting go and crying and releasing, those are some of the times when I feel most alive and most clear. It's almost like that crying is a cleansing process. It's sacred cleansing where, this channel gets opened up inside of me and I'm able to just process. And when I'm connected to my emotions, I feel closer to other people. I feel closer to myself. I feel more creative. I feel more at peace. I feel more at ease. And so this process for me has just been the process of learning how to open myself up in front of other people in safe containers, in safe ways. For me personally, I've gone out and I've sought men's groups. So I really recommend either, finding a men's group in your area. You can look on Meetup or online and see if there's anything. Recovery groups like 12-Step Recovery is an incredible resource as well. And then also, even if you don't have that, starting your own men's group. That's what I did a couple of years ago, and it was really incredible to be able to, not have something and just get a couple of guys together and just start kind of doing some emotional processing in ways that we sort of learned together. So essentially what the thesis that we're kind of proposing here is that we don't have healthy role models in our society that we look up to. A lot of what gets put out there in terms of content on social media is kind of more so of this like rich lifestyle, which there's nothing wrong with having wealth, but I think that what gets shown off is more so of the vanity of having fast cars, having sexual partners, expensive, et cetera, and then perhaps even like having some kind of, vast amount of ego as well. And so our culture actually promotes sort of like this narcissistic imagery and actually rewards it in some way with money and fame. And yet what's interesting about that is most of these individuals may be deeply suffering and we don't know that. And we sort of idealize these lives and these visions. And what I'm calling for here is a return to touching The emotional body is a return to what you might call the right brain, or a return to the heart. And so as men, I think it's important now that we start to cultivate a healthy masculinity that is embodied with the heart, that is embodied with the inner intuitive aspect of who we really are. A lot of my work with men involves moving from kind of like this left brain thinking, which is more so the rational and the logical, into the right brain, which is more so the emotional and the creative. We've been taught not to feel our emotions, so we can be really disconnected from what's going on inside of our bodies. And it can be really profound to start recognizing how much our bodies actually carry. There's a book, The Body Keeps the Score. And what actually happens is anything that we process, every single event we process, the body remembers it. The body holds the memory of everything that's happened to us. And so if you feel depressed or lost or disconnected, or you're going through addiction or divorce or suicidal ideation, whatever it may be, we can trace this back to early childhood experiences and recognize that something happened to us that needs to be processed and grieved. And so until we work through and resolve that, we will be living in the shadow of our own soul. What we're talking about here too is kind of like this Jungian idea of the shadow. So the shadow is essentially this aspect of ourselves that we've cut off from who we really are. Typically this means our emotional body, and the shadow kind of just like lingers around us, and it doesn't go away. It's something that we're not consciously aware of, but it's here and it affects us day to day. Just because we don't recognize it, it doesn't go away, and it doesn't mean that it doesn't also affect us. And so sometimes we'll have these extreme bouts of anger, but typically this happens with nice guys. If there's a nice guy persona, we're always smiling all the time, but sometimes underneath that smile could be deep amounts of fear or anger or rage. If we're presenting this nice guy aspect to the world, then in our shadows, most likely the anger and the hatred that we may feel towards other people. And so learning to integrate these experiences and come to terms with these deeply, they're human experiences and these deep emotions that reside inside of us. Many times growing up in my childhood, I heard man up, I heard don't be a sissy, some other more vulgar words as well, stop crying, what are you crying, things like that, like little shaming sort of aspects. And so I immediately learned that it wasn't okay for me to express who I really am inside. And so when I cut myself off from those emotions of sadness, I also cut myself off from joy. I closed my heart to everything. And one of my mentors has a saying that I really agree with, which is that the river of joy and the river of grief flow in the same river. And so as men, our power comes in our ability to grieve and get back in touch with these emotions. So a couple practical steps for getting back in touch with our emotions. Something you could do right now, right here after this video, is you can journal. Go get a piece of paper and just start free writing. Just set a 5-minute timer and just free write for 5 minutes and just see what comes up. Start practicing just like seeing if you can get in touch with some of these emotions. Usually they come as some sort of sensation inside of the body, but just start practicing journaling to see if you can get in touch with anything. When you feel comfortable kind of journaling with this a little bit, then you can also bring this to a safe person or a safe friend. If you don't have anybody in your life, that's okay. There are plenty of communities like I mentioned as well. So I do also recommend going to some kind of men's group if you can. 12-Step Recovery, once again, is a very safe place to go as well. They're completely free to go to. And then working with somebody one-on-one, like a therapist or a coach who is trauma-informed, could be very beneficial to your healing experience as well. Perhaps going on a retreat if you have the means to do so, to really kind of just disconnect. There are also 10-day Vipassana meditation retreats that are completely free to go to. Definitely worth checking out as well if you're kind of looking at getting in touch with some of these deeper emotions. And just a side note as well, when I start opening up to people and when I see other people opening up, I view that as leadership. I see that as a sign of strength. And I feel more connected to that person. When I open up as well, I notice that people feel more connected to me. I feel lighter in my body, and I feel less tension. And so just offering these to you, perhaps as just a little bit of potential rewards for, having the courage and the ability to tap into these emotions. And I also work with a lot of men who just say, I don't know how to do this. And so that's why it's nice to have a coach or a therapist, because they can help us learn how to access these, because it is a muscle and it is a skill. And there are tools for accessing our emotions. And so just to recap, today basically we just talked about, feeling our emotions, maybe why some of us don't feel our emotions, and then also talked about a couple practical steps to start feeling our emotions. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video, if you wouldn't mind liking and subscribing, that would really help this video get into the algorithm. And if you're on Spotify, if you wouldn't mind rating, and then If you'd like to work with somebody one-on-one, I am currently taking on clients if you'd like to work with any of this and start learning how to process your emotions. Other than that, thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.